All right, recording. All right, so just made basic HTML file, CSS file, another file for my notes. Gonna open them up in VS Code. Use a 2-column layout just because I think it's easy to see. Okay. So of all the CSS properties that you need to understand for precisely placing elements on the page, the most fundamental one is the display property. So I know we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I'm going to review a little bit. Display property has a few important values you should know about. The most common one is going to be block. An element that has its display property set to block takes up the full width of the page and has a line break before and after it. So let's just see that real quick. I'm going to make a HTML file here. And then inside here, we'll just have a div. And there's going to be some content inside of the div. Great. Okay, so now I've got my HTML file, and I'm going to start up a little web server in order to run it. This is slightly different than what you might have seen before, but it's just another way to test out my front-end application. I'm going to cd into the folder where I've got my index.html file. And now I'm going to use Python. I'm going to use a built-in Python module to run a super simple web server. So -m means I'm invoking a Python module just at the command line, not from any specific script. So I'm just call it http.server. And I don't know how to spell Python. We'll try that again. Okay, there we go. So now I'm serving HTTP on port 8000. So I'm now running a web server out of this folder. I want to see that in my browser. I'm going to go to Google Chrome, type in localhost, and then 8000 is the port number, specifically where this app is running. There are a lot of ports on your computer. You can run many apps at one time. This one specifically is running on port 8000. So I'm going to go there. And now we can see some content. So in order to understand the shape of this div a little bit more, I'm going to inspect the page. So we got to right click, inspect. This is open up my DevTools consoles. In the Elements tab, I can inspect all the HTML and CSS properties. So if we check out the div here, we can see its box model. You know, I haven't styled this at all, so it has just the default settings. There's no margin, there's no border, no padding. And then the content is 18 pixels high to accommodate just the text inside of it, but it's also 885 pixels wide. That's the full width of my screen. If I make the window a little bit wider, we can see the box model it updates. It's now 1112 pixels wide, because this div is just automatically taking up the full width of the screen. Okay, so in contrast with block level elements, there are inline elements. They tightly wrap content and don't have any of their own dimensions. So I'm going to refresh the page now. We can see in our div, we've just got this strong tag, which applies boldness to the words that are enclosed in that strong tag. But what I want to point out here is that the strong tag itself doesn't really have dimensions. There's no height and width to the boldness. The size of this strong tag is determined entirely by the contents inside of it. So to show the difference another way, on this div here, I can just edit the styles here right in the inspector. I'll just add like height 300 pixels. And so now when I hover over it, you can see that blue bar, that blue box for the content is much taller. I can just change the height of the div with CSS. But with the strong tag, it's an inline element. I can try to set a height on it, and absolutely nothing happens. You can see the little blue content box is completely unchanged. Trying to set height or width or doing anything to change the dimensions of an inline element does absolutely nothing. They are defined as having no dimensions. It's like shrink wrap for other elements. That's how I think about it. So covered block and inline, both of these seem kind of extreme. A block level element, won't share horizontal space with other elements. If I have 3 of these, they're not very wide. It's only like 3 letters, but they won't share horizontal space with each other. Each one gets its own line. But also inline elements are kind of limited because they can't have their own dimensions. So it's hard to, make a rectangle or a square exactly how you want it if it's just an inline element. So we need some kind of compromise, some kind of a middle ground. There is a third display type called Inline Block. So I think of this as the best of both worlds between inline and block level elements. It has dimensions, but also will share horizontal space. All right, so let's get an example of that. So here we've got a box, get a class on this so we can style it. And let's get a few more of these guys. All right, now over in my CSS file, I have to apply some styles to them. So we had the box class. So first, I want to make these actually look a little bit more boxy. So we're going to add height, width, padding 2 pixels, margin 10 pixels. And then most importantly, display inline block. Now I'm going to go back to my browser and refresh, and something is clearly not working because all my boxes look exactly the same. So pretty sure I know what's wrong, but does anyone want to take a guess before I just ruin the surprise?
You haven't linked your sheet.
Yep. So my HTML file has no idea, what CSS is supposed to be modifying this HTML. I haven't linked it in. So we'll have to do that now. Add a link tag. Say the relationship of this file is a style sheet. There are other things you can link in, but this is a style sheet specifically. And then a hyperlink reference. It's in the same folder as the public folder of my server. So we're just going to call it /main.css. So let's refresh and try that again. Okay, way boxier. Great. So now you can see that all the boxes, they'll share horizontal space with each other. And when we run out of space on one row, they go to the next row. So looking in the inspector, we can see, here is our first row. And then this next div in this list just goes up to the top left of the next row. So this is how inline block elements will naturally lay out on the page. This is referred to as the document flow, just the natural way that elements fall on the page. I like to think of the page as having a sort of gravity to it, where all the elements will fall into the top left corner if you haven't done something else to manipulate them.
I do have a question about how you manage to use the div to make them inline, or not inline, but make it so that it doesn't take the entire row.
That is just from inline block. So we can see that interactively. We look at the box class, and you can see here all the styles that are being applied to it from this class in particular. If we toggle off display inline block, then they'll all stack vertically. Put it back on, and they will share space. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Cool. Okay, so got a question for the class now. This is going to get a little bit trickier, but I want to know how many boxes can we fit in one row potentially. So right now my screen is, where is that? I can't see it. Okay, so can you see the width of my screen in the top right as I'm like making it smaller and bigger? Right now it's about 1100 pixels. So in a second, I'm going to set my window to be exactly 1000 pixels wide. And we know from our CSS that our boxes are 100 pixels wide. So if the screen is 1000 pixels wide and each box has a width of 100, how many boxes can I fit in one row?
I think it'll be 9 because of your margin and padding, maybe.
Okay,
Padding, each box is actually 124 pixels wide because of the margin padding and the border.
okay. I'm not sure if it's exactly 9, but you've got the right idea. So if we set this down to almost there, 1000 pixels. Okay, 1, 2, 3. We got 7 boxes in a row. So let's see if we can clean this up to get 10 boxes to fit in a row. So we were saying we want to take off the margin. So sure, let's take off margin. Now we can get 8 boxes in a row. Still not adding up. When we hover over them, if you notice, it's showing. Geez, I'm trying not to point at my screen because you can't see it, sorry. It shows that it's 108 pixels by 108 pixels. If you look like on the rendered HTML at the top, there's a little tooltip below it, div.box 108 by 108. But that's kind of weird because I set the dimensions to 100 by 100. So I think we already heard the right answer here, but it's adding up the padding and the border here. So the actual width that it takes up on the page is the 100 pixels for the content plus 2 for the left padding, 2 for the right padding, 2 for the left border, 2 for the right border. So the actual width of this element is 108. So there are a few ways that I can solve this problem. I can just do some extra math to accommodate the border and the padding, and then subtract that from what I set the width so that it actually lines up. But that's a bit more of a headache than I want to deal with. So instead, I'm going to teach you about a new CSS property that helps you manage this situation. It's called the box sizing property. So So we're going to set this on everything. We want this to be a global change to our entire page. Going to set box sizing. Now, the default setting for box sizing is content box, which means that only the content of the element counts towards the size. So what's much more commonly used is box sizing border box, which means that the padding and the border are both calculated as part of the width. So if I set that, now I refresh the page, you can see it's not quite perfect, but they are in a little bit tighter. If I hover over each of these divs, now the dimensions actually say 100 by 100. And if I look at the box model here, the content is only 92 pixels. So even though I set the width to be 100 pixels, because we're using the border box sizing and it has padding and border, CSS is automatically subtracting the width of the padding and border from the content to maintain the overall size of 100 pixels for the width of the box. Cool stuff. Any questions? No? Okay, cool. So it's looking a lot better, but we still, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We still got 9 boxes in a row here, and we've got these little spaces in between them still. Does anyone have an idea where those spaces are coming from or what we can do to get rid of them?
I remember there's a property, but I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, there's a lot of properties. So funny enough, this is actually not directly related to a CSS property itself. This is a little stranger. The space that we're seeing in the layout is actually from the spaces in between these divs. So like there's a new line character, because I'm not going to write all my HTML on one line like a crazy person. There's a new line after each div, and that space is actually getting rendered on the page, and it's messing up our layout. So there's a few ways that we can get around this. I could just put all these on one line. Might be one extra space somewhere. This is supposed to fit snugly. Oh, wait, I remember. Hold up. So another reason why this is not lining up perfectly, the body element has a default margin on it. Almost forgot about that. So even though my window is 1,000 pixels wide, we've only got 1,000 minus 16 pixels because of the margin on both sides. So before we go any further, we're gonna have to take that off. Set to 0. If you're setting something to 0, you don't really need to specify units because 0 pixels is the same as 0 inches is the same as 0%. Okay, perfect. So now 999, we get 9 boxes in a row. At 1,000 pixels, we have 10 boxes in a row. So that's, it looks perfect, except now our code is terrible. Like no sane, reasonable person should ever submit code like this with everything on one line. So we're going to find a different solution to this problem. There are a few ways to solve this. all the solutions are terrible. I'm going to show you, my favorite one, the least worst solution for this. One thing we can do is just set the font size to 0 on this boxes div, so that the spaces in between these divs, they still get rendered. They're just 0 pixels wide, so they don't actually take up any space. So we'll go to our, well, first just refresh. So I refreshed, we've got the space in between our boxes. I'm going to set some styles.
I have a quick question I want to ask.
Go
For
it.
the body, whenever
Uh-huh.
so you don't have any elements that are with the ID called body, so what exactly does that apply that to?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
So you don't have any elements with the ID equal to body, so what does the body margin equal 0 apply that to?
Sure. So remember, in order to target an element with an ID on it, we use the hash sign. So like in hash boxes, that's targeting our div ID equals boxes. To target just a plain HTML element, we just have no dot, no hash, no signs, anything. So this is going to target the HTML element called body, which is this guy.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So we've got body margin is 0. Or wait, yeah, that's what I wanted. And then boxes font size is 0. Okay, so now we've got all of our boxes on one line. 10 boxes in a row. But we have created yet another problem. Can anyone spot the problem?
You took away the font inside of your boxes that you created.
Yeah, that's right. So I set the font size to 0 for div ID boxes, but as a side effect, it also set the font size for all of the divs inside of it. Now that's kind of weird because I didn't set font size on those inner divs. And normally CSS properties don't get inherited. Like if I set a height and width on this div, this outer div, it's not going to automatically set that height and width on these inner divs. If I set a border on the div ID boxes, so I set a border on the boxes div, and it doesn't apply to the individual box inside of it because CSS properties normally don't inherit. Normally, you have to specifically target exactly the element or set of elements that you want to receive some property. So the exception to that rule is when you're dealing with font-related properties. Any CSS property that deals with fonts, like font size, text align, line height, color also is a font-related property, I believe. I could be mistaken about that last one, but definitely like font size. Those properties get inherited from parents to children. Because, I mean, imagine logically, like my example before where I have like div, and then I've got this strong tag. If I'm setting a font size on this div, like logically, you would want the same font size to be set on the strong inside of it. It just makes a lot of sense that font related properties get inherited from parents to children. I shouldn't have to set the same font size on every box inside of a box. So for the most part, that is a very useful default behavior, but in this case, it's just not what we wanted. So let's see how we can debug that actually. Let's say I didn't actually understand the situation. I'm just clicking on a box. I'm like, where did my font go? I'm looking here in the dot box. There's nothing about font size. So that doesn't explain it. But if I scroll down, you can see other styles that are applied from other places. Here my star selector gives it box size and border box. And then down here at the bottom, inherited from div hash boxes. We can see that font size is being applied 0, but this border, this is grayed out. So that's not actually being applied, even though this div hash boxes, is inheriting styles or whatever, because this is not a font related style. Font size is. So what we want to do then, just write another CSS selector to override this. So the boxes div itself has font size 0, but for everything inside of it, every single element inside of this boxes div, we're going to set font size to initial. I'm not even going to bother setting it to a specific number. This is a keyword in CSS. That means just set it back to what it would have been normally by default before you inherited your value from somewhere else. So I set font size to initial. Now everything is good in the world. I can see my boxes stacked neatly in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wait, what? Oh, because I put a border on boxes. Get out of here. Okay. So now we've got 10 boxes all in a row. We can still see the font legibly. And I didn't have to write too much CSS to get it working. So yeah, that's how you fit elements in a row and deal with all the various caveats and quirks in CSS along the way. So next, we're going to change gears a little bit, talk about positioning, position, relative, absolute, that kind of stuff. I know we touched on that a little bit yesterday, I believe. We're going to go more in depth in that today. Does anyone have any questions, either about what we were just talking about or what we're about to talk about before I continue?
Yes, I have one.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the difference between the universal selector and the HTML and body? I'm confused when I write the CSS. I don't know which one to choose.
I'm sorry, you're talking about between the universal selector and then
and the HTML element and the body. Yes.
Okay. So remember, the universal selector is going to apply to every element individually. It's going to apply to the HTML element. It's going to apply to the body element, but also individually to every one of these divs and any box inside those boxes or whatever. Whereas the HTML and the body, these are just single elements. Like the HTML element is just the one biggest box that contains all of your other boxes. Body is the first box inside of it. And then there's a bunch of other boxes inside of there. But like if I set margin on the body, oops. Okay. So now I've set margin on the body. So now nothing on the screen is going to be like right up against the edge of the screen, which, maybe looks a little bit nicer for a modern website. And that hasn't been applied to all the individual boxes. I just wanted that on the edges of the screen. So I just applied to the body. It's just this one box that's containing all of my other HTML. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. Any other questions?
I had a question for the box sizing border box that you use on the universal element. So that's obviously overriding the padding and border assigned to the dot boxes.
I would say it overrides the padding and border.
Okay.
Like they still have padding and border set. It's 2 pixels, but
Right.
it changes how CSS uses those numbers, I guess. It changes how the width is calculated based on those numbers.
Okay, because I don't see it doesn't look like it's 2 pixels each, but I guess there's something going on, but it's kind of not paying attention to it, I guess.
You're saying the padding and border don't look like they're 2 pixels each?
Yeah, on each of those, because I mean if you take the margin out, then we're right at 1,000 pixels across in 10 boxes.
Mm-hmm.
So each element still should be whatever it is, 108 4 on each side, but
Well,
they're right at 100.
But I'm saying that's the magic of box sizing border box, is that it automatically subtracts the width of
Okay.
padding and the border from the content.
Okay.
So I've
it's
set
not-
the,
I got it. Okay.
yeah, so I've set the width to
it's
100.
in a way, it's overriding the, not necessarily overriding the height and the width, but it's saying, hey, contents, you're going to be whatever's left
Yeah,
out of what's the padding and the border box, and then we'll make it 100
yeah.
in total. Okay, I got
Like
it.
if
now.
you want to
Thank
say it's overriding anything, I would say that it's overriding the height and width, because I'm setting it to 100 pixels and CSS is saying, well, no, if you've also got border and padding, like we've got to, make the content smaller so that the whole thing is 100 pixels.
Yeah, it's kind of changing the definition of height and width to say height and width, including border and padding and
Exactly.
margin, as opposed to not including.
Exactly. It definitely looks weird because, you get something slightly different in the inspector here than what you thought you typed over here. But down the road, it makes all your math a lot easier.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, let's take a 3-minute break. Just, I don't know, take a deep breath, come back at 10. And we'll talk about positioning.
Hey, Raphael, could we take a slightly longer break? Maybe like an 8?
Here you go.
He gone.
Yeah, if you guys need a longer break, just ask. Usually we try to take like a 8 to 10 minute break every 45 minutes to an hour. But
All right, welcome back, class. All right, so the next CSS property we're going to talk about, we all trickling back in almost here? Okay. The next CSS property we're going to talk about is position. So there's a few different values that the position property can have. The most basic one is static. So statically positioned elements respect the document flow. Those are just normal elements. Everything you've worked with so far is a statically positioned element. Now, another bit of terminology here. If an element has static position, we say that it is not positioned. All right, so all these boxes here, these should be statically positioned because I haven't set them to anything else. I was hoping that was going to show up over here. We're not seeing it. Don't worry about it. So I'm going to change this to a different position property. So we're going to have one special box that's going to get our special styling. So this guy is going to get position relative. So relative, this is kind of weird, doesn't exactly do what you might think it does based on the name. Lets you position an element relative to where it would be normally. So that's kind of a strange definition, but we'll see that. So I've just set position relative on the box, and then I refresh the page and nothing happens. So by itself, setting position relative on an element doesn't actually change how it flows on the page, doesn't change how other elements interact with it. Just by itself, just the position relative property doesn't change anything about how the element displays. Yeah, so we've got position relative here. I can toggle it on and off. Nothing visibly happens. However, because it's not position static, it is now a positioned element. So because it's position relative and not static, it is a positioned element, which means I can use a couple of additional CSS properties on it. So these look like this: left, so these are position properties that I can add to a positioned element: top, left, bottom, and right. Typically, you'd only use one or two of them. Setting top and bottom at the same time doesn't make any sense. You'd only set one or the other. It's just, relative. Do you want to think about moving it from the top or moving it from the bottom? But still, doesn't do exactly what you might expect. So we can see that this box is moved. It's not in its usual place. But I set left and top, yet it moved right and down, which is kind of weird. The only way that I can make sense of this is that the left property is like pushing it from the left to the right 30 pixels. And similarly, top is pushing the element from the top to the bottom 10 pixels. So if we look at this guy, how it's kind of out of place, it's 30 pixels to the right and 10 pixels down from where he would be naturally. Now, what's interesting, though, is that even though this guy, the box, seems to be floating off in space, he hasn't messed up the rest of the layout. So all the other boxes you can see are still fitting neatly into this grid, 10 per row. because position relative only visually changes where the element appears. It doesn't actually change how it fits into the document flow. All right, so that's position relative. We're going to come back to in a second. There's also position fixed. This is pretty simple, so I'll show this briefly. With position, actually, need to make some more divs here first. Still need more. Okay, now I've got a whole bunch of divs, so we can scroll the page, and you'll notice that the special box with the box class is on the same location on the screen, regardless of how I scroll the page. So setting a position fixed has removed this element from the document flow entirely, and now its location on the screen is only relative to the screen, just using left and top based on the borders of my window. All right, so that's position fixed. Commonly used for like nav bars or paywalls or terrible advertisements. This isn't used too commonly, but I know you've seen this before, and this is how you do it. There are any questions before we move on to position absolute? No? Okay, great. So the last value of position that I'm going to talk about, which is the most complicated and probably the most powerful, most useful, so please pay attention, is position absolute. So when an element is positioned with position absolute, it is removed from the document flow entirely and can be positioned relative to its closest positioned parent. So we'll see that in a second. So to demonstrate that, I'm gonna have to make some new HTML here. So we're gonna wait, what? Sorry, I accidentally deleted too much. Okay, comment that out. All right, some new HTML we're dealing with. All right, so pretty simple HTML here. We've just got 3 divs, one inside another, an inner, middle, excuse me, an inner, middle, and an outer one, just so it's easy to keep track of what's what. I'm going to add some styling on them so we can see them a little more clearly. So this is a container, so it'll have to be pretty big. And then lastly, the inner div. All right, so before I render this on the screen, does anyone have any predictions about what we're going to see? Where these boxes are going to be relative to each other? It can be maybe a little hard to visualize, so let's just take a look. All right. So on the outside, we've got our big black outer div. And then inside of that, we've got our large green middle div. But then down the bottom right corner here, we've got our inner div. So it doesn't even look like it's inside of the middle one. It's just kind of like floating down in this corner here, by the corner of the outer div. So to understand why it's positioned there, we've got to first look at the inner div itself. We see it as position absolute. And then we have to find its closest positioned parent in order to know what it's being positioned relative to. So I'll just go to its immediate parent, div class equals middle, and this doesn't have any position set on it. It's a static positioned element, so it is not positioned. So this inner div cannot be positioned relative to the middle div. Now, if we look at the outer div, this one has position relative, so it is positioned. Even though we're not using position relative to move this outer div around, just setting it to position relative allows us to set the inner div, top and left, right, bottom, whatever, relative to the outer div. So, I've set right 5 pixels, bottom 10 pixels, and you can see now that this red inner box is 5 pixels from the right edge of the outer div and 10 pixels from the bottom edge of the right div. So if I wanted to change this a little bit and added position relative onto the middle div, then suddenly this inner red box would be positioned relative to the inner div because that would become its closest positioned parent. So I take this middle div here, just add a style, position relative, and immediately we can see that this guy jumps up over here and that now this right 5 pixels, bottom 10 pixels is relative to this green border of the middle div.
Can an absolute positions parent element also be an absolutely positioned?
Yeah. So like if this big black div is just like floating off in space somewhere and you're positioning it precisely, and then it also still has this red div inside of it positioned precisely like that. Yeah, you can do that. That would be a more complicated example, and I wasn't looking forward to coding that in front of you, but it certainly works.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I was just making sure that was something, or if it always had to be, relative to a relative position.
It can be relative to an element that is relative, fixed, or static, or I'm sorry, relative, fixed, or absolute. All of the positioned statuses that are not static, which is not positioned.
Could you do something like the percentages? Like you want just to put something in the middle of something else? Would that work with this?
Yes and no. Okay, so I wasn't planning to show you this because people don't really do this anymore, but because you asked, I kind of have to now. So let's take away this middle div here. We're just trying to center this inner div inside of the outer div. So the outer div is position relative, inner div is position absolute. I'll set right 50%, bottom 50%. So what do you think of that? Or actually,
Almost, yeah.
I'm going to rephrase this a little bit. Just because I'm accustomed to looking at things in this direction. Okay. So there's top 50%, left 50%. Is this centered?
I guess the
No.
top left pixel is my guess.
Yeah. So centering things with percentages using position absolute like this will center the top left corner of it, or whatever corner you're positioning things relative to. If I did bottom and right, it would have the bottom right corner in the middle. So this gets us close, but not all the way there. So there's another CSS property we can add onto this that makes this a more complete solution. I don't expect you to remember this, but I don't know, you asked how to do this. So I'm going to set a transform property, which is a pretty wacky CSS property, lets you do a whole bunch of like weird rotations and 3D stuff. We're just going to do translate, which just moves it like horizontally or vertically. We're going to say minus 50%, minus 50%. Okay, so that actually works. Now it's in the middle of the screen. So what this transform does is it's just moving the element, but we're again moving it by a relative measure. The thing that's really weird though is in top and left, this 50% is 50% of its parent. So, it moves half the width of this black div or whatever. But this 50% in translate is 50% of the element's own width. So whenever you're using relative units in CSS, you have to know what it's relative to, because it's not always obvious. So here, after I've moved the top left corner into the middle, I've moved the element back to the left 50% of its width, and then back up 50% of its height. So it is now actually positioned dead center. So yeah, there are a bunch of ways to center things vertically in CSS. All of the solutions are kind of terrible. This used to be my favorite solution, I would say. Nowadays with Flexbox, this is much, much easier. If you're trying to center something like this, you don't actually need position absolute anymore. So you should all be thankful for that. I actually had to do this practically for like building websites. So working with Flexbox is a little bit nicer. Yeah, I hope I didn't scare anyone away with that solution. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, I thought it'd be, sorry, I didn't realize it'd be that much a rabbit hole. I was kind of curious yesterday during the circle challenge.
I mean, it's a good thing to be curious about. Like historically, centering in CSS has always been much harder than it needs to be. So I just thought for historical perspective, I wanted to share that with you. Okay, so honestly, position absolute was probably the most complex thing I'm going to discuss today. There are more topics I want to get to, but it's going to get easier from here on out. So if you have questions, I don't know, now might be a good time to ask. Anything else about position absolute before we go on? Nothing? Okay, cool. So next we're going to talk about z-index. So z-index lets you control the stacking behavior of different items, different elements. So we've seen with position relative and position absolute, we can put elements on top of each other. Well, z-index lets us define which elements are on top of which. So I'll make a quick example here. Okay, on the CSS. Colors for content. I need to set background color, actually. All right. So I've got two divs. In theory, they're both supposed to be 60 pixels high, but the green one looks like it's much taller because it's overlapping. It's on top of the red one. So I want to actually define this behavior. So I know specifically which one's on top of which one. We'll set z index 10. Here we'll set z index 20. Note that there aren't any units for the z index. I'm not setting like pixels or inches. It's not like these elements are going to be jumping out of your screen like 2 or 3 feet or whatever. It's just the layers. It's just the ordering. So higher numbers will appear on top of elements that have lower numbers. So now I've just reaffirmed the default behavior. My second div has a z index of 20, which is higher than this z index of 10. So we see it on top. But if I edit this, change the z index to 30, now the red one appears on top. So that's z index in a nutshell, but it gets a little bit more complicated. So the caveat here, and this is a gotcha that I've seen a lot of people get stuck on because they don't fully understand z-index. Z-index is not global to the page, but it's relative to the stacking context of the elements that you're stacking. And I'll show you what that means in a second. So I'm going to make, so I've got my one stack here, 2 items, first and second. I'm going to make another stack. It's right below it. So this is going to be relative, same dimensions. Bottom, we're going to say 50 pixels. Okay, so now I've got first, second, and third. They each have their own z-index, but also I want to apply z-index to these stacks themselves. So these outer containing divs, I'm going to apply z-index to them. So dot stack, you put this guy, position, relative, and z-index 10. And the other stack is going to have z-index of 20. All right, so now if you look in the rendered HTML, you can see still my third stack, my third item is on top of all the others. It's got a z-index of 50, whereas this guy has z-index of 10. This guy has a z-index of 20. Now let's see, what if I try to bump this guy up, set it to 100. Question?
Yeah, Raphael, I have a question. If your div with the biggest height, let's say you had a height of 300 pixels, had also the highest z-index, would that block everything else out when you look at your web page?
I mean, depending on, it could potentially, depending on how you set like the top or top left attributes, the positioning. If you position it so it's completely covering another element and the Z index is on top of it, then yeah, that thing that's below it will be invisible. I don't think you'll be able to click on it. So yeah, you have to be
Perfect.
careful.
Thank you.
That's a good question. If you mess around too much with Z index and like position absolute, position fixed, and you don't exactly know what you're doing, you're sloppy, it's possible to make your website inaccessible by like hiding things that people need to click on under other things that they can't move, especially if you're not predicting the user screen size, if they're on a smaller device than what you'd expected and they don't have extra places to click that you thought they would have. So let's see here. So I was saying, this third guy is on top, Z index of 50. Now on the second one, I can set a Z index to 100, but he's still below the third. I can set his Z index to even 1,000 or just 99999 because I'm a bad developer and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just trying to put this on top of everything else. And it's still going to do nothing. This third item is still on top with a Z index of only 50 because it is inside of something that is stacked on top of the thing that the second is inside of. So this other stack has a Z index of 20, whereas this regular stack has a Z index of 10. So kind of the way I think of it is that each of these stacks here, it's like a folder or a binder, I guess. And then within that one binder, you can, order the individual pages, you can remove them, put them on top of the other ones, change the Z index within that binder. And then in my other binder, I've only got one page in this one, but imagine I had more, I could reorder them within that binder using the Z index. But if I'm stacking multiple binders on top of each other, like the binder that's on top, every page inside of that binder is going to be on top of every page inside of the other binder that's on the bottom. So even though these items individually even though this item individually has a very large Z index, it's still relative to this dot stack, which just has Z index of 10. So everything inside of this dot stack with Z index 10 is going to be below everything in this other stack with the Z index of 20. We saw a question?
Yeah, so just so I'm understanding this is kind of stacking off of like, I guess off a body. Is that kind of like the base level that it'll go to, or like, so the div class stack and div class other stack, you gave them individual kind of stack order assignments. What are they kind of basing off of? What's their foundation?
I mean, I guess I'd say by default, all elements have a Z index of 0, but honestly, by default, Z index doesn't matter because elements won't overlap each other naturally. The only time Z index becomes relevant is if you're positioning elements manually using like position fixed or position absolute, position relative, and then there's the possibility for elements to stack on top of each other visually, and you can use Z index to control that. I think if you don't set a Z index, the stacking behavior is just based on the order it appears in the HTML. So like later elements will appear on top of earlier elements. But if you have elements
that was gonna be my next question, is if we remove the Z index tag for class stack and class other stack, what would the behavior be?
For stack and other stack? Let's see.
Okay, so it kind of kept it even though, or did it move it? Did it trim out the blue? I can't tell. Yeah, it looks like it did trim the blue, the greens on top of the blue.
Yeah, so yeah, this stack is still on top of it. I guess that's not exactly what I was expecting. But I suppose the moral of the story here is if you do have specific expectations about how your elements should stack, you should explicitly set a Z index that enforces what you want instead of relying on default behaviors.
Okay, thank you.
So for the Z index, right, since we're using it to stack I mean, are those numbers essentially just made up? Like, could we just use 1, 2, 3, 4?
You could, but I would recommend against it. So that's actually the very next point I was going to make. These are my recommendations for best practices for choosing numbers for Z indexes. So the consideration here is that you want to be considerate to the developers who come after you. So don't assume that you're going to be the last person who works on a project, and don't assume that you know all the styling needs. It's possible that the person, like, you're going to be asked to build an element and you think like, oh, this needs to be on the top of the screen for sure. And then the next guy who comes to work on the project says, no, this new element that I'm working on, this definitely has to be on the top of the screen. And so, you might have put Z index 999, and then the next guy is like, oh, this needs to really be on the top. I'm going to do Z index 9999. And then, years down the line, someone inherits the project and every element is set with Z index of like 6 to 9 nines. And it's impossible to actually position anything. So what you should do is use like medium-sized numbers, so it's easy for people to put things below and above the things you're positioning, but also use increments of 10 so that people can put things in between your layers. So I might use Z index 100 as like my lowest item, and then go in increments of 10. Yeah. So, this way I can make a few different layers of things, have something at Z index 120, something at Z index 130, and then developers who come after me can be like, oh, actually, there's some stuff that needs to go in between these two layers, and they can make a Z index 125 if they need to. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions? All right, cool. So I'm going to move on now to floats. So I think there's a lot of misconception floating around about floats, what they're for and what they do. A lot of people have observed that floating will move an element to the left or right side of a container. But the problem is that floating actually does a lot more than that also. So beyond just moving it to the right side of the container, like, it doesn't remove it from the document flow. It still interacts with the elements around it, but, excuse me, but not in the same way. So floating an element kind of changes the rules of the document flow. It changes how it interacts with neighboring elements, with their margins and padding and just the boxes in general. And personally, I find it kind of hard to reason about floats. And I think part of the problem is that people use them in situations they're not really intended for just general layout purposes. If truly all you need to do is just move an element to the right side of the screen, you should prefer position absolute or maybe text align right. Okay, so the purpose of floats is for wrapping text around images. So I'm going to show you that. So first we'll get an image here. Just get placeholder image real quick. Great, so there's my placeholder image that we're going to wrap some text around. All right, so this is what this looks like by default. So I've got the image first, but images by default are inline block. So the text is able to start, on the line right after it, and then it wraps around below. So this is kind of the natural behavior. But maybe what you want is, so maybe what you want is more like a magazine style layout where the text wraps around the image. It looks really pretty, but it's kind of hard to do that with just HTML and CSS just because it's all boxes and boxes. So this is one thing that floats help us do really easily. Something's not quite right here.
Raphael, your image tag needs to be closed.
It does. Thank you. Okay, we need some more text in order to really see this. Okay, there we go. So this is, a kind of layout you might see in magazines where there's an image in the top corner, and then there's a paragraph of text that wraps around it. So in terms of, like magazine typography or whatever, this is fairly conventional. This probably looks like an ordinary web page or whatever. In terms of HTML, CSS, though, this is really weird. So like looking at the page, I see the text first in the top left, and then the image is on the right. But when I look in the inspector, the image is the first thing in the HTML, and then the paragraph is below it. But moreover, the box for the paragraph includes the image. So the image is like invading its space. This is really weird. HTML, CSS usually don't work this way. If you try to build something more complex than this using floats, I think you're just inviting pain and suffering into your life. And so I would advise you not to do that. Again, text line right or position absolute are good ways to move things around. Floating is really just for wrapping text around images. Please don't use it for anything else. Now, there are a couple other ways that we can control this floating behavior. Just for completeness, I feel like I should mention the clear property. So if you want to change how non-floated elements interact with floated elements, there's a property called clear. So if I set clear left, then that means that this text block will refuse to share space on its left side with floated elements. Not sure why syntax highlighting isn't doing anything there. Anyways, so I set clear left on this text block and it does nothing. Wait. Oh, I need to save the file. That helps. Okay. Okay, here we go. So on the text block, it's got clear left. This does nothing currently because there aren't any floated elements on the left side of this text block. So if we change it to clear right, now this actually does something. Setting clear right on this text block means that it's not willing to share space on its right side with floated elements. So we can't like invade its space of this blue box. If we turn that back off, then it's much more permissive. It'll let this image invade its space because it floats, and that's how floated elements work. But if you didn't want to do that, you can clear right. It's also clear both, which won't share horizontal space on either side. Honestly, I don't use that too much because the reason why I use float is because I want things to wrap around like this. And honestly, I don't use floats very often at all. All right, any questions there?
I have a question, Raphael.
Go for it.
So I'm like super confused with CSS because I don't, when I'm in, I mean, you could theoretically create an entire layout with just floats. So I'm like super confused as to like when I'm designing a web page, like when to use floats, when to like push things with like text align, when to use Flexbox. Like, is there a specific way we should approach this of like, hey, when you're just starting out, just use Flexbox properties because that's going to be easier? Because I feel like when I create a web page, I use a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and sometimes it just confuses me. So it ends up like a Frankenstein of like aligning elements.
Yeah, so I was actually going to cover Flexbox a little bit later, but I can talk about that briefly now. So, I mean, so I said for floats, like my advice is just don't use them unless you're solving this exact problem. Generally speaking, aside from that, I'd say like use the lightest weight solution that you can get away with. So the simplest thing that works. So oftentimes that's going to be text align right. Like if you just need an inline block element to be on the right side of its container, text align right does that pretty pretty easily. If you can't get away with just moving things with text align like that, I use position absolute. I honestly use position absolute quite a lot, I would say. It's, you know, there's a bit of investment in learning how it works up front because, you know, you have to know the difference between positioned and non-positioned elements and set its parent to relative and whatever. But since it takes the element out of the document flow entirely and you get to place it precisely relative to something else that you're also controlling, I find it much easier to reason about position absolute, and it generally does what I want it to. I'm able to, you know, make it look like the picture or whatever. Whereas working with floats is just endlessly frustrating and they never go exactly where I want them to. So I guess position absolute for most things. Flexbox in particular is for kind of advanced centering considerations. So if you have a row of items or a column of items and you want to center them in some pretty way, you can use Flexbox for that. I'll show you later on more specific situations where you use Flexbox. Does that help?
Okay, so just, yeah, it does. Just to, kind of to recap what you said then. So when using CSS to structure a web page, we want to use the lightest solution possible and try to stick with aligning elements before using any kind of like Flexbox or anything like that.
Yeah. And I wouldn't say that Flexbox is a very heavy solution. It's not the first thing I reach for, but I don't feel too bad about using it commonly. Maybe I would even prefer Flexbox over Position Absolute, but they're often used for different problems.
Alrighty, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, Flexbox is more one-dimensional, I say, and Position Absolute is more two-dimensional.
Raphael, I also have a question. I don't know if this even makes sense, but I know we're talking about like building web pages. Is there, when speaking about CSS, is there any reason to differentiate between a quote unquote like web page that you might land on to like, I don't know, read some blog post versus like a web application? For example, like, I don't know, Canva, or I don't know, just there's millions of like web applications like a Gmail or something like that, where you log in and like you're playing around with like this and that and like actually doing work as opposed to like just reading something. Is all the CSS you're going to use? I mean, it's still like it's going to apply just the same to both like situations.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. I mean, there are a lot of differences between those two kinds of applications you described, but it's not in the CSS. I would say that the styling work for those can be very similar. I mean, they also can be very different. There are different ways that people set up the CSS for their websites, you know, different like automation build systems and compilers or whatever. But just like a blog versus a web application, they could potentially have the CSS set up delivered in the same way.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Going once, going twice? All right, why don't we, let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 11, and we're going to talk about overflow.
Hey, Raphael, do you want to pause the recording?
You already left.
So now we're going to talk about overflow. So the overflow property controls what happens when there's too many elements inside of a parent and they don't all fit. So we're going to go back to our boxes div here. So we're going to make these boxes a little bit bigger. Where's the top box? Okay, so I made our boxes a little bit bigger, but you can see that this div hash boxes has automatically expanded to accommodate all of them. So that's the natural default behavior in HTML. If you don't specify the height of a container, it'll automatically get as tall as it needs to be to contain all of its children. So right now it's 750 pixels high. So let's change that a little bit. We're going to set an overflow property on the boxes div. So common value is hidden. Oh wait, hold on. Before I do that, actually, just set a height. Set height 400 pixels. Oh, I put that selector in the wrong place. I'm sorry. Okay, so now if we look at the screen visually, it doesn't seem like anything has changed. We're still seeing all of our boxes, they don't fit on one screen. We have to scroll down. But if we look at the parent, things don't quite make sense because we can see this blue content box only goes down 400 pixels, like with the height that I set here in my CSS, but the content is still clipping outside of it. All the boxes inside of it are taking up as much space as they need to, and they're going outside their container, and it's kind of weird. So this can happen in HTML and CSS. If you set a fixed height on a container, and then there's too much content inside of it, it's going to overflow outside of its container. So if we had a border on this boxes div, that's going to look even worse, I think. I'll make that red. So now we can see the red outline of where the boxes div is supposed to be. And clearly we have many boxes outside of that. So if I don't want that, I can control that with Overflow Hidden. I think it's Overflow Show is the default value. Or visible. Actually, let me just double check that. Okay, yeah, overflow visible is the default value for overflow. But I'm going to set it to overflow hidden. So now, all these boxes still exist. You can see these ones in this row are like half covered, and then the ones below here are just completely invisible. They're just off the page, but like I can still, inspect them in the inspector here. They are technically part of the page. I could access them with JavaScript. It's just a user isn't actually able to see them or click on them. So that's overflow hidden. If there's non-essential content that you're okay with being cut off, then sometimes this is okay. But more commonly, what you want to do, if there's too much content to fit in a container, is overflow scroll. And overflow scroll, as you may have guessed, adds a scroll bar. I said adds a scroll bar. There we go. So now, there's still too much content to fit in this boxes div, and it's still 400 pixels high, but I can still view everything because overflow scroll put a scroll bar here, and I can scroll through and watch stuff. Do be careful though with this. It's definitely possible to have scrolling sections inside of scrolling sections. So like I can scroll this div here, but if I could also scroll the page, like that would be a huge pain. So let's see here if we add this back in. So I'm like scrolling this div here, and then when I get to the bottom, it scrolls the whole page. So there isn't really any way, like when I'm up here, to scroll the whole page without scrolling this div. It's kind of awkward. So if you're messing around with multiple scroll bars like this, it's good to constrain the width of the scrollable area. So now like I can scroll here on my little scrollable div, but also I can put my mouse to the side and then scroll the actual web page. So if this div was full width of the page, then I would lose the ability to scroll the actual page without scrolling the div. So, you know, this can be a useful technique for putting more content on your page than legitimately should fit there, but just be careful, make sure you don't make it inaccessible or frustrate your users. Especially if users are using like their fingers on a touch device. You know, even if they have a small area to scroll, it might be hard for them to scroll on that consistently with their fingers, or you might be forcing them to only scroll on one side of their screen. So there are a lot of accessibility considerations when you do this. Also, you might just not like that scroll bars appear for elements that don't need them, because overflow scroll will always add a scroll bar. So a nice compromise then is overflow auto. You're not going to see any difference in this case, but let me tell you that if you're building a dynamic website and the content comes from the database, it's user contributed or whatever, you might not always know how much content you're going to have, and you might only want the scroll bars sometimes. So overflow auto will add the scroll bar only if it's needed. And if you don't have enough content that it overflows, then the scroll bar is removed. I think on Mac OS, this actually doesn't do anything, or it doesn't do anything different than overflow scroll, because Mac OS will automatically hide all scroll bars regardless. So you can't have it like, you can't use overflow scroll to have a permanent scroll bar, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So according to CSS, I should have a permanent scroll bar here, but Mac OS will hide it whenever I'm not like actively scrolling it. And now it doesn't seem to be scrolling. I'm not sure what's going on there. There we go. Now I'm scrolling the inner div, and then we're scrolling the outer one. So kind of point in case that having multiple scroll bars gets kind of messy. And you can even see like on the left side of my screen, there's like the overlapping scroll bars, and it just looks kind of glitchy. So like, I don't know, just be careful with that. All right, so I'm going to move on now and talk about pseudo classes and dynamic classes. Before we move on, does anyone have any questions about overflow? No questions. Great. Yeah, it's not a very complicated property. All right, so now I'm going to talk about pseudo classes or dynamic classes. They're like classes, but you don't choose them. They get applied based on the user's actions. So let's add a link here. I'll put it at the top of the page. We're going to get rid of this relative box. Okay. All right. So we got a link completely unstyled. So this is the default link. If I don't do anything to it, they're bright blue. I click on it, turns red. Sorry. Then when I come back to the site, it's turned purple because it's a previously visited link. So there's some dynamic styles that are applied to it based on my interaction with it. And I can use CSS to control that. So I'm going to give this guy class. Only got one, so not going to use a very imaginative name right now.
Raphael, the browser knows that you went to it because like the browser itself, like it is like saying, you know, it's like what applying a cookie or something. So that's why it knows you visited the website, and that's how it's able to make that purple. It's like you don't have to tell it like tag it as like they clicked the link or something like that. That's all handled by the browser.
Right. I wouldn't say that this is cookies in this case, which is how the browser is able to remember it, but you are generally right. The browser does remember a lot of things that you do, and this is one example of that. So it keeps track of what links you visited in the past. I don't know, like you have history, maybe it fishes it out of there or something. But somehow the browser does keep track of links that you've clicked so that it can render them in different colors.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so I'm going to apply some styles. So the first pseudo class I'm applying is actually not very interesting. The link just applies to anchors when they don't have other dynamic classes applied to them. So this is kind of the default color. So there's our green link. Cool. It's nice. It's nice when people hover over things sometimes to give them some indication that they're hovering over something interactive. So maybe we change the style a little bit on hover. So that's another dynamic class. When you're hovering over an anchor, we will, I don't know, add a border. Okay, so didn't like putting the border on the anchor, maybe because it's an inline and it doesn't actually have dimensions. So I just applied the hover on the H1, and now it's working how I expected. So when I hover over this H1, it gets this :hover pseudo class applied to it. And then suddenly this selector matches and the styles are applied. Whoops. Now, something else I want to show you. Okay, so you might find it hard to debug hover states because, you know, normally I want to like click on an element and see the styles, but the hover state only exists while I'm hovering over the element. So I can't be hovering over the element and then also go down to my inspector and then check the styles that are applied to it. So one way you can get around that is in the inspector here, right click on an element. And oh my gosh, where did it just go? Force state. And then I can set this to hover. So now, while I'm debugging my application, this link is going to act like I'm hovering over it, regardless of where my mouse is. And if I could apply that to the H1, this would work differently. I'm not sure what's going on. All right, let's try a different style. Okay, so on hover, it turns orange. It's anchor, force state, hover. So now this link is going to be orange constantly, even though I'm not actually hovering on it. And when I inspect it here, go to the inspector, I can see the hover style is applied. Now, of course, I'm not actually hovering because there's no way I could debug this application while constantly hovering my mouse in that one spot. So I can use the dev tools here to kind of fake it, force it, just for my debugging. I'm going to take that off. And then last link state I'm going to show you is visited. So because I've already clicked on this link, it's red. I will change that to a different link. Say CNN.com. So now it's a different link. I've not clicked this one yet, so it's green. I hover over it, turns orange. I actually click it. Gosh, CNN is so slow. Let's go back. And now it's red. Any questions? Questions? No?
Yeah,
Okay.
so the I'm a little confused. So the colon that you're putting after, that is what is like, so you've written the tag, and then to access that dynamic class of the tag, you just put the colon, and then it's like, hey, now you've like gone into some of the different you can access those different dynamic classes. So like different, if I understand correctly, then like different tags are going to have different classes, dynamic classes associated with them.
Right. Not all dynamic classes apply to all elements. I think hover is pretty universal, but like visited, this only applies to anchors, for example.
Okay.
And right now I'm going to show a few dynamic classes that only apply to inputs.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. Why don't I actually put this on multiple lines? Just make it a little more conventional.
I'm not sure if this is in alignment with what you want to teach today, but how do we get it to affect different sets of links that we want to interact with differently, like different hover effects or different colors?
Use classes. If you know that there is some set of elements and you want all of these to, turn orange when you hover, you can just make a class for like turn orange. And just so something like that. You just apply that class to everything that you want to behave that way. Make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's because I had tried that yesterday, but maybe I had a typo or something. So I'll review my code.
Potentially, it might just be debugging. I do want to caution you, like generally I wouldn't write a class name that's this literal. That's just like what mechanically happens on the page. But you normally want to name things for like why they are what they are. So this might be for like high priority links or something. And so everything that's a high priority link gets this specific hover style. Or maybe it's just, for profile pictures, always turn orange when you hover over them. And so we apply this specific style. So like generally the class name should refer to how it functions in your application and like why it exists, not just like mechanically what it's doing. Because like someone new to this project who's reading this CSS file is going to rightfully wonder like, okay, but why do we turn things orange when we hover over them? So just having a more meaningful class name can help with that. All right, so now we're going to talk about input elements. So inputs are great for forms, for taking data in from users. All right, so we've got one input. Just going to call it the input. Just make it a class. It could be an ID since there's only one of them, but whatever, doesn't matter too much for such a small demo. So we got our one input. By default, it's just this. I can click on it. I can type into it. But now, do you notice that it looks like it already has some default behavior? You see how it changes colors a little bit when I click on it? Yeah. Oh, geez, didn't mean to click that link again. Yeah, so when I click on this input, it gets the blue border around it and the cursor starts flashing. That's called focus. So focus is an event in the browser. It's a thing that happens at a specific time when I click this input. And it's also a state. It describes the ongoing condition of this input. It is a focused input as long as the cursor is flashing and you've got the border. Then when I click anywhere else, okay, I'm just going to remove this link. That's frustrating me. Geez. Okay, so I click the box, it is focused. When I click anywhere else, it is blurred. So blur in CSS is the opposite of focus. So I know this sounds a little bit strange because you think of blurring as like fuzzy vision or whatever. And, it's like smoggy outside and it's hard to see. In CSS, all blur means is it's the opposite of focus. I don't think there's actually a pseudo class for that, but when we get to event handling, that's something you'll have to deal with. Just anything that you do on focus, you'll want to undo on blur. And as I'm talking about focus state right now, it seems like a good time to mention the opposite of that. So then on the input, but not just always on the input, when it is focused, say color orange. I'll do a different color. Burleywood, great. I like to mix it up a little bit sometimes. There's a lot of fun CSS colors. So here, I am typing text, and you can see my text is this kind of like beigeish orange color because currently the input is focused. As soon as I click anywhere else, the input is no longer focused, it gets blurred, and now the text goes back to its default color. So another type of input that you should be familiar with, say checkbox. Very useful, very common. And there are also some styles that are specific to checkboxes. Does anyone want to guess what a pseudo class or dynamic class specific for a checkbox might be?
Checked.
Yes. So if it is in the checked state, we can, let's make it bigger. So here we've got our default checkbox. It's very small. Default checkboxes are not very big, not very pretty. But when I click on it, because it was at the top of the page, I had to scroll up. So when I click on it, it gets bigger, and now I have this gigantic checkbox, 200 by 200. But then when I uncheck it, it loses that checked dynamic class, and so it goes back to its regular size. So one more set of pseudo classes I want to share with you. Well, maybe two more. But so next we're going to talk about input validation. I'm sure you've been like trying to sign up for some website and like you type in your email address with a typo and it turns red and says, you know, that's not a valid email address. Please correct it or whatever. And then the inputs all turn green when it's successful, stuff like that. You can do that with validation in HTML. So let's see, I'm going to extend this input here. Type equals email. So there's a handful of different input types. I'd recommend you take a minute sometime to learn about the different types. You know, the generic input is just a text box you type into. Some of the input types are radically different. So type equals checkbox is totally different from the regular input. You know, you can't type in this. It's just a Boolean yes or no. But type equals email is still a text box that I type into, but it adds validation to it. So now this text box has pseudo classes that will be applied to it, either valid or invalid, depending on whether the validation passes, whether I type a valid email into this input box.
Is the validation applied specific to the browser then? Like the browser implements that validation?
It is, but you should expect that all browsers implement it the same way.
Cool, thank you.
I mean, you should expect that, but you shouldn't trust it. So like, I don't know, it's a reasonable expectation that all browsers should do it the same way. But for professional purposes, I would not rely on the default behavior and I would specify exactly what my organization considers an email address or not, just so that, you know, we know exactly how it's specified, but also so that it's consistent across all browsers.
Gotcha, thank you.
We got the input. So when the input is valid, we're going to make it green. And when the input is invalid, we're going to make it red. We're going to put this style on the bottom. So here's my input. I just type, you know, as I'm typing, currently the input is focused. So this focus pseudo class, it's on the bottom, it's going to take precedence. So we're getting the Burleywood color. As soon as I click away though, you know, this is not a valid email address, so it turns red. Because this input is in an invalid state as defined by the type on the input. Oh, and helpfully, if I hover over it, actually gives me this little tooltip, tells me what I should do. So email validation, like by default, is actually not very robust at all. It just checks that you have an @ sign in your email address somewhere. So I guess it's a little better than that, but like me here. So that's a valid email address as far as this HTML validator is concerned. So if you want, you know, more reliable validation than that for email addresses, you might want to do some kind of custom implementation. But still, even if you have a more sophisticated way of validating the inputs, you're still going to be leveraging these pseudo classes of valid or invalid on the input. You're just going to have custom ways of determining if something is valid or invalid instead of relying on the browser's determination. This is again really helpful for accessibility. If you have users for your website that, you know, are, I guess, blind primarily. So if you just like highlight inputs in red or green when they're valid or invalid without actually like using the HTML like input validity system, like that's just something you put on their screen, and then blind users aren't going to actually be aware of that. So they're going to be missing that extra information. But if you use it, if you use these pseudo classes like this, so, you know, when the input is in the invalid state or in the valid state. We apply these colors. Well, like blind users aren't going to see these colors, but they are going to have other ways of detecting that the input is in a valid or invalid state. As long as you're conforming to like HTML5 conventions, you're just doing things the standard way. Users with disabilities will be able to hook into your website and get what they need. So just, I don't know, there's a lot of good like accessibility and like validation built into the browser. Don't reinvent the wheel, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, and then one last pseudo selector that I'm going to show you is for relative position within a list. So here in this div ID boxes, I've got a whole bunch of boxes inside of it. They've all got the same class. They're all the same element. They're all divs, but there are still some ways that I can style them differently from each other. So I say hash boxes. No, actually. So first relative position pseudo class selector is first child. This will not target all boxes, but only the boxes that are the first child of their parent. Oh, and it's being overridden actually by that style. So because this selector has an ID in it, this one just has a class. This is going to override it. So I'm going to make this other selector a little bit more specific. So now I'm only targeting things with the box class inside of the boxes ID div that also have this pseudo class. All right, so now we can see all of our boxes are not the same. This first one gets a font size of 46 pixels because it is the first child of boxes. Similarly, there is nth child, which lets you select any child. So I'll say nth child 6. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sixth box gets these nth child 6 stylings. So note that it was the sixth box, not the seventh box. CSS is generally 1 indexed instead of 0 indexed. When we're counting indexes of arrays, the first item is element 0, and then it's element 1, 2, 3, whatever. So that's kind of a fun part about jumping back and forth between CSS and actual programming languages, is trying to remember where you start counting from. But so just remember here, there is no nth child 0. So nth child 6 is going to be the 6th box in this list over here.
Is there a reason for that?
Why CSS is 1 indexed as opposed to 0 indexed?
Yeah, why they chose to do that?
I mean, I can only hypothesize, but theories that I think might be valid are that A, they didn't choose it. It was just kind of an accident. And then at some point it was too late to take it back because CSS was already in the wild and people were using it. Maybe they thought that CSS would be used more by designers and not by programmers. And so programmers, like counting from 0, that makes sense. But a designer is probably not going to have that same kind of background and might find it more intuitive to start counting at 1. So these are technologies designed to be used by different people, I guess. But the short answer to your question is I don't know. Anything else I can help you with?
That was it, thanks.
Cool. Any other questions before we move on? I'm going to talk about Flexbox very briefly. No questions. Okay, cool. So I'm going to show you Flexbox. This is another setting of the display property. So Flex is a newer property for display. Like traditionally, for most of my career, everything was just block, inline, or inline block. Display Flex is relatively new. I'd say as of like a couple of years ago is when I first felt comfortable using this in production code. But nowadays, this is available everywhere, so I wouldn't be shy about using Flexbox. Flexbox does not remove elements from the document flow, but kind of changes how the document flows. And it's mostly to help you center things in a row or column. So note that it's not for two-dimensional layouts. So that's more what CSS Grid is for, which I know people have been asking about this, so I'm just gonna give my opinion. I think Flexbox is very useful to learn. I don't recommend learning Grid, at least not right away. I think of CSS Grid as being more for framework designers. So like the people who wrote Bootstrap, they should know CSS Grid. For us using Bootstrap, we don't really need to know Grid. It's enough if we just know how Flexbox works. That's my opinion. I think Grid is generally a more complex and more sophisticated tool than what you'll generally use. And if you're actually using Bootstrap, it'll honestly replace like Grid for most of the situations where you'd want to use it. But so Flexbox is really cool. Changes document flow. Yeah, helps
That's
you.
really good advice, Raphael. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. So I like Flexbox. I think I'm fairly proficient with it. I tell other people that I like it and I use it. Literally though, every single time I use Flexbox, here's how I start. You go to Google, we type CSS Flexbox, and we go to this article. I swear to God, this is like one of the best articles on like anything technical I've ever read. CSS Tricks is a terrific blog for everything CSS, and honestly, a lot of things that are not related to CSS. They actually featured one of my projects here once, which had nothing to do with CSS, which I appreciated but didn't understand. Chris Koye is a cool guy who knows a lot about CSS and is very good at writing about it. So I don't know, I accept pretty much everything he writes. Also figure that like CSS is hard to learn about, hard to understand. Like nobody really teaches this in schools. There isn't great documentation on it. Everyone's just kind of learning through experience or from blog posts. So I think csstricks.com is a really great resource. But for Flexbox in particular, I think this is one of the best articles on this site. And I refer to this all the time when I'm trying to remember all the specific Flexbox properties. But also, if this is your first time using Flexbox, this is a good introduction to it. The background, basics in terminology, explains all the stuff you need to know. But so basically, long story short, if you want to use Flexbox, excuse me, step one is you have a container and you set display flex on it. And then you can set some other properties on the container to control how the items inside of it line up in a row. So then you can set other Flexbox properties on the container to control its children, such as flex direction. So normally elements are laid out from left to right, but if you want, you can set flex direction. And instead, the rows will form right to left, top to bottom, bottom top, whatever you want. Flex wrap, normally if you fill up one line, elements will continue on at the next line below it. But if you want, you can have it not do that. You can have it wrap in the reverse direction, like a snake or something. Okay, justify content is probably my favorite one. This is the one I use the most commonly. If I have a row of items that I need to line up, but I don't want them to be like really ugly like this, like flex start. And I don't want them to all just be squished in the middle, like center. I really like the space between, space around, and space evenly properties. These kinds of things are really hard to build without Flexbox, but with Flexbox, it's just one declaration. So I'm just going to show you that real quickly. Wait, where'd my HTML just go? So down here, all right. So first I have to set display flex on my flex container. And then the actual flex style that I wanted is space around. So we'll say justify content, space around. Oops. I need some more styling on the boxes so you can see them. Just creating a little space here. Okay. So down at the very bottom of the page, we have our flex container. All I said on it was display flex and justify content space around. And I have not even set any flex properties on the children themselves. So if you want every child of a flex container to be handled the same way, you only need to put properties on the container. You don't need any flex properties on the children themselves. The only reason why I put properties on the children themselves is if you want one item to be handled differently from the others. So like here, I've got my super elegant balanced layout where everything is evenly spaced with space around. If I want to see what other values look like, I can just kind of scroll through here in the inspector. Most of these are not very interesting, but space around, space between, space evenly are all kind of similar. And just depending on the website you're building and the sense of style you've got, you might choose between them.
Raphael, if I may.
Sure.
If you go back to where you were just at playing with the flex container styles, like click on your flex container in the thing. There's a cool little button that I don't think I've ever seen before. I'm trying to click on your thing. It's div class flex container. You click on that, and then so we can inspect your styles. Down.
Oh wait, I'm sorry. Yeah, so many boxes here.
Yeah, right there. Go
Yeah,
to
okay.
display flex. Right next to it, there's a little button. Click
This
on
guy?
that. Yeah.
Oh, Flexbox Editor. I've never done this either. This might be new.
Played with it today. Dude, you can just go through there and click on all the different things, and they kind of have little examples of what they're doing, and then it'll just flick through them all.
Oh,
And
yeah, cool.
it's the coolest little thing I've discovered, I don't know, since this morning.
That is nifty. I mean, it's pretty similar to just like typing in here, like whatever properties you want, but maybe you don't memorize offhand all the flex properties and you don't want to be referring back to this article every 3 seconds. So yeah, that's
It's super nifty, and it adds them and stuff. So if you didn't even have it assigned, it'll just automatically add them in. It's pretty legit.
Huh. Yeah, I swear this did not exist last time I was working with Flexbox. So this is pretty cool. Yeah, so these are not all of the Flexbox properties, but I think these are the only ones I use. They're definitely the most most common, most popular, most useful ones. So another Flexbox property I like is align items. The default behavior is everything is at the top, I believe. But, depending on the aesthetics of your site, maybe you're trying to show a bar chart. You want everything to be flex end, or you want everything to be centered. So I was talking before about how centering things in CSS used to be a big pain in the butt. Now it's a lot easier with Flexbox. So that's just align items center on the parent, and that just centers it vertically, no fuss. And so I was saying that there are some properties that you only set on an individual element if you want it to act differently from others. So one example of that is flex grow. The use case for this is, let's say you've got 3 items in your nav bar, and you might expand the window, you want the nav bar to expand, but you don't want the first and the last item to get any bigger. They should stay exactly the same size, but you want the middle item to expand as the window gets bigger, but only to a certain point. It should get up to 200% as big as its original size, but not any bigger than that. So if they've got like a widescreen monitor, it's not going to be like 3 feet across, but it should respond a little bit between like a phone and a laptop. So that's flex grow. I put this on just the item, and that makes that one, use up all the extra space as it becomes available. But honestly, I don't use this super often. Generally speaking, when I'm reaching for Flexbox, it's because I want justify content and then one of these. Or sometimes justify content and then also align items. It does more than that, but most commonly, those two are why I'm reaching for it. Any questions about Flexbox before we move on? We're going to talk very briefly about Bootstrap, and that'll be the end of today's lecture.
I have kind of a weird question, Raphael.
I love weird questions.
How do you work with media queries and Flexbox together? Do you just like forget that you're dealing with Flexbox and media queries will handle what they need to handle? Is there any special consideration when using any kind of media queries with Flexbox, or you just treat it like any other CSS property?
I wouldn't say there's any special interaction between media queries and Flexbox. There is like some overlap in that they're both intended to handle screens of different sizes. But I guess the main difference is that Flexbox is more dynamic. You just set one property and then it's supposed to respond dynamically to whatever screen width. Whereas media queries, you set very specific breakpoints. So it's like a lot of effort if you want to control what happens at every single pixel width with a media query, but at least you have the precision to make exactly what you want happen where you want it to happen, at very specific screen sizes. So I guess my recommendation would be to start out building a responsive layout using Flexbox first and see if you can get that to dynamically handle screens of any width. But most likely what you're going to find is that like you've created this cool Flexbox layout, but it only actually works for screens that are bigger than 500 pixels and less than 1200 or something like that. I don't know. So you could use Flexbox in your media query. Say we're only applying Flexbox between those pixel ranges, and when it's lower than that, then we're not going to use Flexbox at all. We're not even going to try to center things on such a narrow screen. You just stack them vertically.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? No other questions. All right, so we're going to talk about Bootstrap a little bit. I think I should probably make a new HTML file for this. So I'm going to do that real quick. I don't know why I always have trouble spelling Bootstrap. Just like the T's close together is really weird. Bootstrap demo.html. Okay. So maybe wondering, what is Bootstrap? I don't know if we've covered it all, talked about it all, if we have any prior knowledge, background, or whatever. So Bootstrap is a very popular CSS framework. Essentially what that means is it's just a style sheet or a bunch of style sheets with a bunch of predefined class selectors, predefined CSS rules that you can use in your projects. It's kind of like a jumping off point, lets you stand on the shoulders of giants and not write quite so much CSS yourself. Broadly speaking, it does a few different things for you. So I would say that Bootstrap provides normalization. So you may have heard that many elements look differently in different browsers. They have just different default settings for, fonts and font sizes and margins and padding and whatnot. So if you make a really simple website and you don't specify all the styles, it can look different in different browsers. So what you should do is just set specific styles for every single element, so you don't have to rely on the browser defaults, but that's kind of a hassle. So Bootstrap does that for you. So one of the first things that Bootstrap does is it will set default styles for every single element so that it looks decent enough, but also consistent across browsers. It helps you build your layout using the grid system. So this is, I think, kind of the core feature of Bootstrap. It has a lot of nice bells and whistles in it, but this is like why Bootstrap exists. It's for the grid system. And this is honestly largely why I don't think learning CSS grid is particularly important, because the Bootstrap grid is much, much easier to learn than CSS grid, and is, in my opinion, powerful and flexible enough for whatever styling problems you'll need to solve. It's not perfectly powerful. It can't do literally everything. CSS grid is more flexible, but I don't think you're going to need it anytime soon.
I think I've downloaded Bootstrap solely for the grid system and then just went from there.
The grid system is really great. If you use one thing from Bootstrap and it's the grid system, that's enough.
Agreed.
So also Bootstrap helps you build responsive design. It uses media queries and relative units. So media queries, we heard that referenced earlier, but I'll just show you an example of that really quickly. I never remember the syntax for this off the top of my hand. But so this is a media query. They're kind of like if statements for your CSS. They let you define styles that only apply for certain device types. So here you see at media, that's how you know it's a media query. Only screen, so this only applies to people using a screen, because you can write media queries for printers, for example. So like your Nav Bar doesn't appear if someone prints out a page, that could be useful. But here we're targeting screen, and only if the max width is 600 pixels. So when that's the case, we change the body background color to light blue. I'll just paste that in here. Excuse me. Just fixing the indentation real quick. Oh, and I'm on the wrong page here. So I've got my web server running in this folder here. And when I just go to localhost 8000, by default, it serves index.html. That's a very strong convention on the web. If a web server doesn't know what file it's supposed to send, but there's an index.html, it sends the index.html. Since I want to go to a different page, I want to go to bootstrap demo.html, I'm going to have to actually type that in. Cool. So now I'm there. And there's nothing on the page, so we're not going to see anything. So I guess this is what I expected so far. So first, I'm going to have to add Bootstrap to the page. Like I was saying, it's just a CSS file. So we can add it with a link tag. Let's grab that real quick. Just go to the Bootstrap website. Their front page is actually pretty useful. It has a lot of the things that I want up front. Just scrolling down a little bit, and gets me the CDN link. So this is another server off somewhere else, JS Deliver, that is hosting Bootstrap just so I can download it from them to use in my applications. So I don't actually have to download the script onto my local machine and then like put it next to my other CSS files. Like I could do that, just download Bootstrap and then put it here with my other CSS files, but I don't want to do that. Instead, instead, I'm just going to copy this link tag from Bootstrap and use their server to download it. So that has a couple of advantages. For one thing, so now users going to my site, when they download, they go to the HTML page and it's going to have a whole bunch of links and scripts. And so they have to download a bunch of more stuff from my server. So one HTTP request actually can trigger many more requests and put a lot of demand on your server. So by putting some of those resources on other servers, it sort of lightens the load. So instead of having to download all the CSS files from my server, it's like they download some of them from my server, and then some of them they download from the Bootstrap CDN. So I'm not having to handle all of those requests. Also, these CDNs are very redundant. So it's not actually just one server, but they've got a whole bunch of servers all across the country. And when you go to download it, like on whatever web page, it'll automatically choose the one that's closest to you so you can get it most quickly. And I'm sure there are other minor optimizations that I'm not aware of, but generally, serving files from a CDN like this is going to be faster, more efficient than serving them yourself. It's also just easy. So I've just got that link in there. And now we have Bootstrap loaded on our page. So again, we don't see anything. But if I check the network tab, that's where you can see files that are downloaded in order to run this page. First, it downloads the HTML file, of course, but then it downloads these other CSS files. So I haven't written any HTML yet, but I'm pretty sure this is working. Note also that I put my CSS file underneath the Bootstrap CSS file. That's deliberate. The point is that Bootstrap is going to set a lot of good defaults for me, but I might want to override them. So if I write a style with the same specificity as a Bootstrap style, I want mine to take effect, mine to take priority. So I put my style sheet below the Bootstrap style sheet. All right, so in order to actually use Bootstrap, or I'll be more specific, in order to use the grid, first you need to start off with a container. So this is a class that Bootstrap provides to us. So in fact, this CSS file is empty. Well, other than this media query, it's empty. So this class container, this was written by Bootstrap. I'm just using it. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to show real quick this media query because I forgot to actually demo that. So sorry for the brief aside. But so this triggers only when the screen is a max of 600 pixels and then turns light blue. So we can see here when my screen is very small, it's light blue. As soon as it becomes greater than 600 pixels, it goes back to the default color. So that's effectively how media queries work. These are kind of, I think of them as being more of a heavyweight solution. This is like the big guns kind of. I try to avoid using media queries when I can get away with it and just use things like Flexbox or use relative units like percentages. There are other better relative units, but we'll maybe cover that in a different lecture about responsive design. But sometimes you come up with a layout that doesn't work at certain screen sizes and you need a totally different layout for those screen sizes. So media queries are a very powerful and precise tool that let you do. All right, so back to Bootstrap. We've got our container here. So that was the first step for using the grid system, is we create a container. And then inside of that, we have to create a row. Again, it's a div, class equals row. And then inside of our row, we can have up to 12 columns. But where this gets interesting is that each column can be more than one column wide. So I'll show you. So here I've set up a little grid. Here's my container. Here's the row. And then each of my columns is taking up 1/3 of the row. Because remember, it's a 12 column grid. 12 divided by 4 is 3. So each of these 4 columns is taking up 1/3 of the row. If we give them slightly different numbers, this is 2 of 12. This guy is 6 of 12. Make it a little weirder. So still it adds up to 12. But now they're all differently sized. So I can control, relative to 12, how wide each of these columns is. If you need more control than that, you can put rows inside of columns and get even more organized. So this second column, it's like really big. Maybe I don't want to think that this is actually just like the second column, but the first column is like a sidebar, the third column is a sidebar, and the second column is the main content. And, I'll put more columns inside of that. So inside of this div, put another row. And then I can put another set of columns that again add up to 12. So the 12 columns, that's not like an absolute measurement of the whole page, but it's relative to the row it's in. So I'll put okay. So now we've still got, our first row or first column, it's 2 columns wide. Third column is 3 columns wide. And this middle one is 7 columns wide. But then within it, those 7 columns are divided up into 4 and 8. So again, this 4 and 8, this is relative to the 7. So, when I add them together, it's not going to be as wide as this outer row. The 12 columns added together are just going to be the width of the column that they're in, which is only 7 columns wide. So every row, the columns add up to 12. You can put rows inside of columns. You don't have to think too hard about the parent relationships. Kind of want to put some borders on these, maybe make them a little easier to read. Maybe that helped. I'm not actually sure if this is a better visualization. But so basically, point I'm trying to make here is that columns can have rows inside of them. So this is actually very flexible. It's much more than just like a 12 column grid that can be, grouped by 2, 3, 4, and 6. There's a lot of flexibility in how you divide this up if you want to put rows inside of your columns. But so where things get more interesting is with the dynamic classes. So like I said, Bootstrap is very good at helping you with responsive design. And so usually when you specify classes, you also specify a screen size. So I'm going to make a much simpler example so we can see that. So instead of just call2, I'm going to say this is call MD2. So what this means is on, I'll make that bigger. So on medium-sized screens, this is going to take up 4 columns, and this is going to take up 8 columns. All right, so up here around like 970 pixels, this is a medium-sized screen. When we get smaller over here, this becomes a small size screen, and so it no longer applies these column classes. They're just stacking vertically. So if you want to handle different size devices, you'll often combine many of these classes together. So for example, here on medium screens, this is 4. Let's just add on large screens, it's 8. And then the bottom one gets the opposite treatment. All right, so here, this is now a medium screen size. You can see the first column is 4, second one is 8. As we expand, we just passed a breakpoint. We're now at the large screen size, where the first column is 8, and then the second one is 4. So, see, more commonly, a case where you might need to do something like this. Let me think for a second. Okay, so we've got a whole bunch of these, whole bunch of columns. You might notice that this is definitely going to add up to more than 12. That's fine. If there's more than 12 columns in a row, it'll wrap around. Bootstrap should be able to handle that. Oh my gosh. Okay, I did this backwards actually. So I accidentally used the more dense layout for smaller screens and then the more like spacious layout for larger screens, which is absolutely not what I want. So on small screens, it's 6, medium 4, large 3. Okay. So now when I'm on a large screen, I've got space for all these items. And so I'm going to put them 4 in a row because on large screens, they only take up 3 columns. So we can fit 4 of them into 12. At slightly smaller screen sizes, we hit a breakpoint at some point. Okay. So we hit breakpoint here. Now we're in medium mode. Each of these divs is column medium 4, so you can fit 4 into 12 3 times. So we can get 3 columns in 1 row. Then when we go down to small screens, they're 6 columns wide, so we can only fit 2 per row. Gets like that. And then when we go even smaller than small to extra small, it'll go back to the default behavior of just stacking vertically. Because when the screen is that narrow, there's really nothing else you can do. Are there any questions about the grid system or dynamic columns, responsive columns? Going once, going twice. Okay, so one last thing, I'd want to show you a little bit of the Bootstrap components. So, what I just showed you was the core feature, the grid system, but it also has a lot of bells and whistles that you might want to just be aware of, know they exist. I'm not going to code out any demos for you because honestly, 90% of that demo would just be copy and pasting from the Bootstrap docs, and they already have live examples in the docs. So I'm just going to show you the docs. Honestly, you should get familiar with the Bootstrap documentation. It's really good and very informative. So down over in components, they have a bunch of widgets that have, they're pre-built components with HTML, CSS, and also JavaScript. So these are actually fairly functional. They all do things that you could probably do yourself. Like you could reinvent these, but it's going to be a lot of effort, probably a lot more code, really messy, and maybe not work as smoothly, might be more buggy than the Bootstrap version. But anyway, this is a collapse. It just lets you kind of hide a div, hide some content under somewhere else. This is showing you how to do it. You basically just copy paste this code into your app, and then you'll have this. You can put other Bootstrap things inside of these buttons, inside of these links, or put these links inside of rows and columns. All of the Bootstrap components, play well with each other. So just tinker with it, see how you can combine stuff. But the core of this is if you need some hidden box that explains something or whatever, a collapse is a simple way to do that. And they're animated too, so it's pretty cool. So more sophisticated than a collapse is if you have a whole bunch of collapses together, that creates what's called an accordion. So you might have seen something like this in FAQs. It's just a whole bunch of different collapse sections, but with some extra logic so that when you open one, it closes the other ones. And I guess that's optional though. You can have them all openable simultaneously if you want. There's a lot of ways you can configure these, but just know that if somebody ever asks you to make an accordion for like an FAQ for a website, don't do it yourself. You're going to have a bad time. Please just use the Bootstrap version or some other pre-built accordion. It'll probably be easier for you to learn how this works than for you to like reinvent your own accordion. Another good one is the Carousel. I know you've seen these before. When you've got too many images to put in a small space, you use a carousel. So here it's just this one box for the carousel, and you put a whole bunch of images inside of it. And then the users can scroll through it as they please, or it'll just auto scroll. You can configure that again. Drop-down menus. These are pretty handy. You know, they look pretty nice. They look nicer than the built-in HTML select. You can style them very easily. They're not very hard to work with. I do want to note, though, that Bootstrap doesn't have multi-level dropdowns. So you open this dropdown menu, and then you can't open another dropdown menu from these. That's actually a deliberate design decision. I believe Bootstrap used to have multi-level dropdowns, and then they were removed at some point because they decided that nobody likes that and no responsible website should use multi-level dropdowns. It's just, they're hard to navigate and easy to lose your place if you're not very precise with your mouse movements. And so it becomes an accessibility issue for some users. Modals are really good. This is basically just a pop-up box. Here we go. So I click this button. The screen gets grayed out. This box appears on top. It's got this X button to cancel out of it, but I can also click anywhere else on the screen to dismiss it, or I can just press the escape button, which you can't see my keyboard, but trust that I just press escape. So these are really great. I love them. It's functionally the same as just a JavaScript alert box or a confirm box, but alerts and confirms just don't look very pretty and you can't style them. So if you want to have that kind of functionality of just popping up a message to the user, a modal is a much nicer way to do that. And again, you could build this yourself, but there are a lot of little caveats to how this works. You know, making sure that like the rest of the page isn't clickable, but also making sure that the user doesn't get locked out of the rest of the page because it's not clickable. Like you have to be able to dismiss the alert and then get back to what you were doing before. Keyboard needs to work. I don't know. There's a lot of little things that go into making this work. But the process for you using it as a developer is actually much simpler. So I appreciate all the complexity that this saves me from, just all the little details I don't have to worry about. And of course, you can put rows and columns and other Bootstrap things inside of your modal. All the Bootstrap things combine well with each other. And then lastly, this is the very last thing I'm going to tell you today before I release you all, the Nav Bar. Building a good Nav Bar is hard, I would say, because it's got to look good. That's where your brand information goes. But also it needs to be responsive, ideally. So, you need to see all the elements spaced out cleanly on large screens, but on smaller screens, you need to make sure that it's still accessible. So this is a pretty common UI pattern you might have seen before. They call this the Hamburger Menu, because I guess if you squint, it looks like a top one and a bottom one with some burger in the middle. But if I click that, it shows me the same items that were laid out horizontally in the nav bar. And let's see if there's a better example here. Yeah. So if there was a drop-down menu in your nav bar, again, it just gets converted to a vertical drop-down within your vertical hamburger menu. So it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but at the very least, like you can design a nav bar that looks good on laptops or big screens, and with no additional effort, it will be at least functional for a cell phone. You might want to put extra work into styling it, maybe use some media queries so it looks exactly how you want to. But at the very least, Bootstrap Nav Bars give you this hamburger menu built in and just some general responsiveness. So I like them. I'll usually find a nav bar that I like and then copy paste it and then modify it to suit my needs.
Raphael, logistically, when you're wanting to use these, then you just go to the docs page and you literally just hit copy and then paste that into your document, or is there some way to access those from within VS Code? You know what I mean? Or I'm sorry, where you just say I don't know, class nav bar and then that populates or something, or you literally just cut and paste?
Yeah, I just cut and paste. I mean, they gave you this copy button right here. If you personally find that like you are specialized as a CSS designer and you're just like all day, every day using tons of Bootstrap components and you need a faster way to do it, like there's ways you can set things up in your own editor. So you just, type 3 characters and then it dumps this entire thing out on your screen or whatever. That's definitely configurable. People certainly do that. There was a time when I used to do lots of HTML and I used to have a shortcut where I would just type HTML like that, and it would replace that with the full HTML boilerplate, HTML head, body, with a link for CSS, script tag, whatever. So if you find yourself, I guess I'll put it this way, as a developer, you should not tolerate tedium. If you find yourself doing something boring over and over, know that like everything that you're working of is made of code and you know how to write code so you can make your tools work the way you want them to, or someone else has already done that. Definitely try Googling before you go out and solve problems yourself. But yeah, you should feel empowered, feel like things should work the way you want them to. And if you're typing too much to like get these predictable snippets into your page, there are definitely ways you can automate that, make your workflow more efficient. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah, that's it. You just like literally copy those out, paste it in, and you're ready to roll.
That's what I do, because I don't use these every day. And even when I do, like I'll probably use slightly different nav bars from one project to the next. And I'm always, considering them. It's a tough choice. I have a hard time making aesthetic choices sometimes. So I don't use Bootstrap quite enough that I felt the need to automate my workflow like that. But if I was just a professional full-time CSS designer and that was like all I was doing was just using different Bootstrap components, I would find some way to make that easier for myself.
Cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Any other questions before we break? Going once, going twice. Okay. Thank you for coming to my lecture. So that's all. I'm going to release you to lunch, and I guess put the lecture notes up on, or the video goes up on YouTube. I don't know, everything goes where it goes. You'll be able to see this later. Have fun. Thanks.
Thank you, Raphael.
Thanks, Raphael. I like the notes file. That's going to be pretty useful later on.
Oh, cool. I'm glad you appreciate it.